Hey class, this is video number 3 with regard to Latinx Americans. Just a couple other groups that I wanted to summarize for us for our class that the book profiles. So the next group in our book is Dominican Americans. The Dominican Republic shares half of an island with Haiti. And since 1980, we have seen a sizable immigration to the United States. About greater than 1 million have immigrated to the United States since then. Primarily, they settle in the New York City area, particularly in certain neighborhoods such as Washington Heights and Manhattan and the Bronx. And we also have high populations in New Jersey, Florida, Massachusetts, and here in the southern New Jersey as well. Interestingly for them, they're somewhat more insular than some other Latinx groups where they coexist alongside other ethnic Latinx communities, particularly Puerto Ricans, but retain a strong, distinctive Dominican cultural identity, right, which is very important to them. Some Dominicans often replace other Latinx communities that have left ethnic enclaves and neighborhoods. We call that the invasion succession phenomenon. So we do see that in some areas in which we see large concentrations of Dominican Americans. The majority, the big push factor for Dominicans has been poverty on the island. So Dominican Americans here generally have been seeking better employment opportunities. However, they do suffer, in comparison to other groups, a higher unemployment rate, lower in specialized skills, oftentimes live in poor neighborhoods and lower education levels. However, second-generation Dominicans have been better off in all these indicators. So the more time Dominicans have been here, they have been able to advance a little bit further in the socioeconomic strata. Particularly if you were white, or many Dominicans. Well, there's a diversity in the Dominican population, but those that are darker, that are blacker, definitely face a lot more racial discrimination. So there's that. The next book that the next group that the book profiles is Salvadoran Americans. They have their push factors are limited to resources on the island, dense population. It's important to understand some of the history with regard to El Salvador. This is a Central American country, and there was a period in which the growth of agribusiness, particularly multinational agribusiness, had grown and displaced rural peasants from where they lived, and their lands were taken over by wealthy landowners and other big businesses in agriculture. And so this displaced peasants, this group generally first came to the capital, San Salvador, and they suffered severe economic hardship and repressive political violence, particularly during the Dirty Wars in the 1980s. So about 20 to 30% fled. And they were initially denied refugee status here, even though they were fleeing political repression and murder. And they were painted as leftists by the Salvadorian government, and of course our government as well, which did not like communism. Anything that was considered protesting against the repressive regime was considered communist sympathizers, so they were not received favorably by the United States. So this is when we start to see what's called the sanctuary movement in the United States, particularly with churches and clergy hiding Salvadorian refugees in churches, protecting them from deportation. Right? So in the 1990s, political events improved in the countries. However, the legacy of this violence and the U.S. support of it in El Salvador continued, and this has caused more recent migration. It's important to understand the more recent migration of Salvadorians is definitely tied into political events in the 1980s, absolutely. And then, of course, there's chain migration for those families that are already here of Salvadoran descent as well. So Salvadorans in the United States tend to form tight-knit ethnic communities alongside other Latinx communities, particularly in Texas, California, New York, and the D.C. metro area. Right. So Colombian Americans is the next group. Colombia is a country in South America. It's the highest source of South American immigration, which is probably why the author Perillo chose to talk about them. About 1.1 million live here. The most important push factor for Colombian immigration has been the 50-year-long civil war, which just recently ended in a peace agreement. There was widespread violence from the government forces, rebel forces, as well as narcotraficantes, drug traffickers, who were often aligned with rebel forces. Um, uh, the stats in the book talk about how about 60% of Colombian Americans were foreign born, and there's a mix of all classes of Colombian Americans. Many come from high levels of education and socioeconomic strata. Many come from lower levels of socioeconomic strata and education. Definitely mixed racial composition. You have Afro-Colombians, you have more indigenous Colombians, you have mestizo, like all that, right? So it's a mix of, they're very mixed racially in the United States, mostly concentrated in New York City and northern New Jersey. When I went to university, my undergrad, it was in Morris County, and there's one town that was a few train stops over from school in Dover that had a very large a Colombian community, and I was friends with many of them, and really awesome guys. They were. Other larger populations are in Florida, D.C., and California. Um, Discrimination usually stems from Colombia being associated with the drug trade, particularly cocaine and violence, which is sad because most of them were fleeing this violence in the first place. So there's some discrimination, stereotyping with regard to Colombian Americans from that perspective. So the next section of the book talks about assimilation and median income and stuff like that. With regard to assimilation, it's really difficult to talk about the differences between Latinx groups because they're so varied, depending on political factors, depending on cultural factors. Um, so it's very hard to talk about assimilation. Basically, one of the general things we can talk about is how the longer the amount of time you here, the more you become acculturated and assimilated into dominant society, not necessarily foregoing or discarding your ethnic identity and roots, but with regard to assimilation into the workforce and higher levels of education and stuff like that. With regard to education in comparison to other ethnic groups, there are noticeable differences between Latinx groups, but generally overall, they tend to be less likely to complete high school and undergraduate studies, and this has many reasons, such as linguistic differences, but perhaps with newer immigration, which may be less educated, higher high school dropout rate, particularly among Mexican and Central Americans. Sometimes limited parental education. If your parents are mainly foreign born and English acquisition is limited, so there's some. But it's important to note that U.S. born Latinx people have much higher graduation rates. So with regard to income levels, median family income tends to be for Latinx groups higher than blacks but lower than whites. There's about 23%, according to the stats in the book, represent middle class families. About 23% also are in poverty. Cubans and some South Americans tend to have higher percentage of middle and upper class membership in United States society. Dominicans tend to have a higher percentage of poverty. Most new immigration obviously relies on low skill, entry level, low paying jobs, so this is figured into the equation as well. So most new immigration definitely relies on businesses rely on this to pay, sometimes substandard wages, and this means that the newer immigration generally tends to be in a lower socioeconomic strata. With regard to what else do I want to talk about? Sociological analysis. I wanted to talk about, I think the conflict view is probably the most interesting way to analyze the experiences between Latinx groups and dominant American society. I think one particular theory that we learn in chapter 2 can be very important and helpful, could be the internal colonialism theory, wherein you have the Anglo takeover domination of Latin America, particularly after Guadalupe Hidalgo, but also our domination in the Caribbean and particularly in Central America as well, historically, which we are not going to get into too much in this class, but that had a very important consequence for later immigration as well, right? Also, the idea of the barrio, the Latin neighborhood as an internal colony that's dependent on Anglo investment and subservient to Anglo domination. If we look at Puerto Rico, this really fits the experience of Puerto Rico as kind of an eternal colony, even after it was no longer considered a colony, became a free associated state, right? Um, or a commonwealth, if you will. The continued segregation of Latinx people in some neighborhoods and some cities and ghettos is a byproduct of this colonial relationship, right? Also, it's important to think about the economic exploitation of Latinx Americans, particularly undocumented farm workers and others in industries, and this is very important to understand. So, resolving problems that of this exploitation and other social and political problems has only really come about through the civil rights agitation and political action of many groups, such as the United Farm Workers and Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, as well as other Latinx groups. Um, the Latinx people have become a very important politically in the United States as a political bloc. And so much of this activism, we're seeing it now. A lot of this activism from Latinx communities really coming to the forefront, becoming politically active, particularly with regard to issues such as immigration, our policies, um, stuff like that. So I think this is all I want to summarize as well. So I thank you for your patience with regard to the 3 videos for this chapter as well. I think this will be the last chapter where we have as many videos, but I hope they were helpful to give you kind of a summary so far as to what we are reading and what we are learning. And I miss you guys, in particular, I miss you guys already. It's only been a week, so 2 weeks or whatever since I last seen you. So anyway, I hope you're all doing well. If you need me for anything, please give me a holler, and I'll talk to you later. And good luck with your discussion board posts and watching the documentary. And that's it. Thank you. Bye.